Hello ladies, gentlemen, and my NB friends, and welcome back to the Keldean channel. I'm your host, Keldean, and today we're going to be talking about Peak, the absolute greatest game that I was completely blind to until I got to try it for myself just here recently. In case the title and thumbnail didn't give it away, today I will be going over 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, one of my favorite games of all time. That's not an exaggeration. I know that I said that for Persona 3 when I did my initial Keldealysis about it, but I really do mean it. 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is one of my favorite games of all time, and it really does fit right into my top 5. The gameplay is ridiculously fun, the story is phenomenal and engaging, the characters are all different and likable for their own reasons.
What is she doing here?
I think as long as you love each other, it's okay.
I love Persona 3, but even then there were a few things that I thought it fumbled on. With this game though, I am truly at a loss. There are some personal preference things that I'll mention, but this is the closest to perfection I've seen a video game come. Okay, that's enough of the flowery intro, yada yada yada. Let's just roll the title clip and get right into it. I've said it once, I'll say it again. The most important part of a video game is the gameplay. If a game isn't fun to play, then what's the point? Well, lucky for us, 13 Sentinels has killer gameplay. No joke, the game actually killed me. The game is split into two main parts, the visual novel story and the actual RTS gameplay. We'll get into the story visual novel stuff in a minute. I feel the RTS gameplay would be the best to bring up first. The RTS gameplay. My lord, is it perfection. You are given 6 different units to control that are split between 4 distinct types, known in-game as the Sentinel generations. These different generations suit different roles. You have the Gen 1 Sentinels that focus on melee, the Gen 2 are balanced units, Gen 3 are long range, and Gen 4 are the support units. There are little quirks about them to keep in mind beyond their moveset as well. For example, I found mobility and movement to be a huge factor in a lot of situations. The Gen 1 melee units move faster than the Gen 2 or Gen 3. The Gen 4 Sentinels are flight units that can fly over buildings not having to follow the set roads. This makes some units, like Takamiya, really useful for certain situations. More on her in a minute. This sounds par for the course, and I suppose it really is for most RTS games. As someone that isn't really into RTS, I found it to be very well done. The challenge comes from, believe it or not, the strategy. The R and the T aren't really huge factors because the game pauses when you select a Sentinel to make their move. It's less real time and more so just strategy. The S, the actual strategy part, is a huge factor though. The farther you get, the faster and stronger the enemies get. So you get an idea as to what the attack patterns are. Now you need to figure out how to better deal with them now that they're like hitting faster, hitting harder, they're moving faster, and they're taking longer to kill. It's basically the same handful of enemy types just repurposed, and in the context of the story, just being upgraded. So they're literally the same type of enemies, just better. To counterbalance that, you have the same 13 different Sentinels to choose from. You can only have 6 chosen, and each have their own unique traits and some unique moves as well. This means that 2 Sentinels of the same generation are wildly different in actual gameplay. Takamiya and Goto are both Gen 4 support Sentinels. When I used Takamiya, I was more focused on offense. I used her better movement to either get in position to take out a heavy enemy, or to occasionally shield the team if someone close by was in a rough situation. I used Goto for purely support. He was best suited for either anti-air or to purely assist the other Sentinels with shields or teleportation. 2 Sentinels of the same generation, but both served completely different purposes. To best explain, I'm going to use Takamiya as the example. She gets a move unique to her called a quad leg spike, which is a pretty decent melee attack that hits 4 times and ignores armor. She also has a trait called Brawling Prodigy, which increases the damage of that attack proportional to how far she moves before attacking. There's also a feature in the game that makes attacks from behind deal 1.5 times more damage. Do you see where I'm going with this? Increase damage by 50%, get the damage from moving the max distance before, and you have a move unique to your unit that is just all around really good. This is the ultimate combo that makes Takamiya my favorite unit in the RTS segments. Her Sentinel is just so good and can dish out good damage when need be. This is that strategy that I was talking about before. It's fun to just find these combinations that work well and finding practical application for them during the battle. Okay, so you pick units and they're all different. But what exactly is the gameplay? Well, there's 3 areas and they're made up of 10 waves each, not counting the tutorial or the post-game areas. There's also a final battle, so that makes up 31 RTS levels in the main game. Each wave is basically a round of defending the point. You get the same sort of enemies swarming you from different directions, and it's up to you to either defeat all of them that spawn in, or wait until the timer runs out. Side note, I've not once had the full timer even reach half, so most of the time you'll end the wave by defeating all the enemies that spawn in. There's the point you're trying to defend called the Aegis Terminal. The enemies are pathed to the terminal until a sentinel gets within range. You lose if one of your pilots dies or if the terminal is corrupted. The enemies vary between different types and they all present different types of danger. There are the drum mines, enemies that move really fast to the target, and then they'll just stop to blow themselves up and deal good damage to everything around them. There's the twin tails that just sit far away and will continually attack from long range, mostly shooting missiles towards the terminal. Then there's also the RPFs, big mobile factories that will continually spawn in smaller units until it's defeated. So you're given a pool of enemies and it's up to you to identify them and get your sentinels ready to best deal with them. I don't think I'm really fit to explain why things are fun, and I'm struggling here just to explain the core basics of the general gameplay. So like I said with the Persona 3 video, it's pretty straightforward, and just by watching this video you'll probably get a sense of what it's like. As someone that doesn't really play many games like this, I was just blown out of the water by how fun and snappy it is. Saying, oh, there's 4 sentinel generations and the same few enemy types makes it sound really small. But the game does really well to expand on the formula, and it has a lot of little things that compile to make the actual gameplay really interesting. Like I mentioned with Takamiya, there are just cool moves you can pull off, and when you get it all to work at just the right time, it's just so satisfying. The strategy also comes in the form of pre-planning. Not only do you have to decide on which 6 units to bring in for each wave, but by default each unit can only do 2 waves before being made unusable for the next one. This is the brain overload system. Each time a pilot is used for the offense team in a wave, their BP meter is filled. When the BP meter maxes out, they suffer what is called a brain overload, and isn't usable on either the offense or defense for the wave. There are 2 ways to have pilots recover. You can either run a wave without them, or use the recover option during pilot selection. You see, there's a score and ranking system for each wave. Getting an S rank on a wave will get you an extra lore tidbit that isn't required to progress. That said, it is required to 100% the main portion of the game. For each consecutive wave you complete, you are given an increased score multiplier. If you use the recovery option to reset all of your pilot's BP meters, that score multiplier is reset as well. This little brain overload system is such a neat way of throwing a wrench into people's plans. It makes it so the same 6 units aren't just used over and over, and causes the player to come up with varying strategies and experiment more. If you don't care about the score though and would rather just use your favorites, you're perfectly capable of spamming recovery to do just that. This system is very cool in my opinion, and I really just like how it got me to get out of my comfort zone for some of the waves. It forces me to make sure all of my sentinels are equally leveled without really causing me to grind. It's a neat system and I just can't express that enough. Speaking of S ranks, let's talk about it and the bonus objectives for the waves. Obviously the S ranks we've touched on and are pretty self-explanatory. It's basically a way of judging your score at the end of every wave to see how good you did. The higher the score, the better the rank. S is the highest rank you can get. Like I stated earlier, these will give you little lore tidbits required to 100% the game. Alongside the S ranks though, are these bonus objectives. The bonus objectives are these optional criteria that change per wave. Sometimes it'll ask you to choose a specific pilot to use. Sometimes it'll ask you to only use 4 pilots instead of the full 6. Completing the wave under these optional conditions will reward you with, believe it or not, another lore tidbit required to 100% the game. I like the S rank and bonus objective system because it's completely unnecessary to enjoy the bulk of the game, but it offers an extra challenge to the RTS gameplay as well as little pieces of extra context to things relating to the story. It's really cool, and I can proudly say that I, someone that is by no means a completionist, has 100%ed the main game. I say the main game and not the entire game because there is an endgame that doesn't contribute to the in-game percentage trackers. There is a final zone for the RTS gameplay, the Samire Ward, a zone that has 9,999 waves. It's meant to emulate an endless mode and offers no bonuses for attaining S ranks. It has no bonus objectives, no story before or after the waves, it's purely just more gameplay for the player. And you know what? I really like that. Now on the topic of S ranks in the extra quasi-endless area, I think now is a good time to talk about the difficulty with the gameplay. The first area isn't really difficult at all. It's actually really easy, and that was a critique I had when I talked about my first impressions. The second area was a steep ramp up in difficulty, and it really thwarted me. After the second or third wave though, you get better, get upgraded properly, adjust your strategy, and you start doing a lot better. Then the third area comes along and it was just pure chaos. Same deal though, you master the craft of 13 sentineling and you start doing better. I struggled with a couple of S ranks, but I got it. Then the final wave and fourth area come around and holy shit, is it insanely hectic relative to what just preceded it. My point with this is that the game has very hard ramp ups in difficulty that aren't really easily planned around. On one hand, I quite like the jump up as it gives you a quick and harsh idea of what to expect going forward. On the other hand though, it makes the story progression stagnate and also makes the sentinel progression take place all at once. If you can master the first wave or two of an area, you've mastered all the waves of that area. There isn't much upward difficulty within the areas themselves, so you're just forced to grind a couple of the waves to get more points so you can upgrade your sentinels all up front. And I found that if you're comfortable with the first wave, like truly comfortable, can S rank it, then you are set until the next area. And I really don't know if that's a good way to do progression or difficulty. Having an identifiable difficulty for each area is completely understandable, but there's such a disconnect between them at that point and it becomes really hard to adjust to each new wave. At a certain point, it doesn't feel like difficulty, it just feels unfair. Like how the hell are you supposed to adjust to this so quickly? Honestly, I just don't think you are. Full disclosure, I did play on intense difficulty, i.e. the hardest difficulty that is offered. I switched during the first area because I found the game at that point to be ridiculously easy, so mileage may vary. I'm not going back through to re-S rank all of the waves just for testing, but given how it is, I can only assume a similar pattern is followed for the other game difficulties. And quick mention, since I had it jotted down in my notes to include in the script, Wave 210. More on this specific wave later for narrative and presentation reasons, but right now I want to talk about its actual gameplay. The 5th and 10th waves of an area are boss waves. Wave 210 marks a turning point in the story and at first glance looks really difficult and off-putting. I didn't quite know what to do at first. Then I realized I had Takamiya on the team and used her to bypass all of the enemies and use the combo I mentioned earlier to insta-kill the boss, thus ending the wave. I got an S rank first try and there was no serious challenge whatsoever. I thought this was funny and felt it was worth mentioning due to how important the wave is to highlight this specific exploit. To wrap up the RTS gameplay side of things, I want to touch up on the Sentinel upgrades. The Sentinel upgrades are split into 3 main parts: the experience progression, the skills used, and the stat increments. Whenever you use a pilot on offense, they get experience at the end of the wave. At certain levels, they unlock unique traits that benefit them in battle. This is how that Brawling Prodigy trait I mentioned earlier is obtained. There's no cost to get it, just play the game and you unlock it naturally. The next part are the skills used. Each Sentinel generation gets a similar move pool that you can purchase and upgrade for use using the in-game currency of meta chips. Certain skills have little bars above them, and which skills have bars vary depending on the pilot. You fill the bar by upgrading the skill, and once all 4 bars are filled, then a completely unique skill to that pilot will be unlocked. The upgrade cost for this unique skill is much higher, but the practicality of it in battle is also much higher relative to the other skills. You know the Gen 3 Sentinel's railgun is very good, so obviously Natsuno's unique wide-range railgun is going to serve a very specific purpose during the waves that she wasn't really capable of filling before. And the final part of progression are the stat increments. You eventually unlock the ability to increase certain parts of the Sentinel to give minimal, arbitrary stat increases. To be frank, none of these are realistically useful and worth upgrading, especially given the cost. Out of curiosity myself, I upgraded Jiro Kurabi's Sentinel a bit and he performs roughly the same as he did before. Like, I genuinely don't notice a difference. There is one part that, when upgraded, increases the Sentinel's BP meter. So upgrade the part and the pilot can now be used in 3 ways before suffering a brain overload. I found this to be very useful and allowed me to have more freedom in how I chose my teams for each wave. This is the only part that's really worth upgrading, which is such a shame because this entire system is just pointless really. Like, it could have been a great way to progress and get stronger, but it seriously just isn't. And it's also just a huge waste of meta chips, but it's presented like this grand thing. So if you're playing this game, stay far away from this, don't ever touch it. And that's all I have regarding the RTS gameplay. Now let's quickly touch up on the main bulk of the game, the visual novel story. Just in this segment, I want to talk about the gameplay of the visual novel part. No spoilers yet. You play through the main story from 13 different perspectives, the perspective of each of our pilots. Each one focuses on something different within the story, and each character has their own arc. Certain roadblocks are put in place, making you complete an event in someone else's story before progressing further with the one that you're already doing. Some of the waves in the RTS mode require you to get an overall percentage of completion in the story mode before it lets you continue there. All of this allows for a more satisfying window to view the general story in, and it makes sure you're balanced in a narrative sense. The actual gameplay of the story segments makes use of a thought cloud system, as I'll refer to it. Basically, when a word, character, or item is mentioned, it gets added to the thought cloud. The player can then select it for the character to think back on whatever it is to provide further context as to what it is or how they perceive it. It's a great way to bring the player up to speed, especially if they're cycling through all of the characters as the game intends. This leads to some really cool light puzzle solving moments. One moment in particular is the Sekigahara story, when he's doing the second phase of the downtown ward. This time there's a police standing in the middle of the side venue where you keep starting the story from. If you use the thought cloud on the phaser that Sekigahara has, he pulls it out and it gets the police officer's attention, thus starting the next branch of his story. This is just a really clever moment that I really enjoyed. It makes excellent and creative use of this system for more than just its intended purpose. The last thing I want to touch up on regarding the gameplay is actually something I praise Murder on Iridanos for. That being how the game actually lets you be the one to determine the pace of the story. A game showing you the story doesn't hit nearly as hard as being able to be the one going to the right location, speaking to the correct people, interacting with the right objects, etc. I mentioned the phaser as a creative use of the thought cloud system, but it's also just really cool how you're given limited freedom to just move around the space, and you, the player, have to be the one to pull it out and cause the next part of the story to occur. With Murder on Iridanos, I praise the discrepancy amplifier for allowing you to get right into the story and be the one to uncover things for yourself. In 13 Sentinels, you are controlling the characters and learning everything right alongside them. This is just excellent storytelling, and it also keeps the player from taking a back seat. You're still very much involved, and that helps for discovery and engagement. I cannot stress enough just how well this is handled and why it's so important. Okay, now we're getting into spoiler territory. I highly encourage anyone to go into this game completely blind, so if you're watching this and haven't played or finished the game, this is your only warning. Before I touch on the story, I want to talk about the 13 pilots. Well, not all of them, but instead a select few and their story arcs that I really enjoyed. That said, I was truly surprised by how well they juggled 13 different characters to play as. Each one is actually unique and vastly different compared to any of the others. I don't mean that as, oh, their stories and scenarios are all different, even though that is still true. I mean that instead as each character has their own personality that stands out, and they are all memorable for different reasons. Let's start with Natsuno Minami. Not much to say here other than I find her little nerdisms about aliens super cute. Basically, she's super into these like ancient aliens type shows, and then meets a sentry drone from another sector. Instead of saying, oh, this little mechanical thing is a robot, she is instead infatuated with it because she believes it's an alien from the show she watches. She does what she can to help this robot because of this, and she has this attachment with it, thus motivating her entire story. I just really like that. It's very cute and tame compared to the rest of the characters. Since I brought up the sentry drone, let's talk about Miura, because my god, what an amazing hook. Keitaro Miura is first introduced to us as someone during a transmission log during the year of 2187. In the far distant future, he's talking with Natsuno Minami about self-replication and the Pacific War. Flashback to 1944 in Sakura National School building. Miura is there and he seems like a completely different person, with no knowledge of the transmission that just transpired. He instead seems timid, anxious, but also very brave and honorable. His country is at war with America and he is chosen to be a Sentinel pilot. The Daimos appear, tear up the sector, and he believes they are American weapons.
What is that? Another American weapon?
This leads him to risk his life to protect his country and his family, and he gets in the Sentinel to fight them off. By complete accident, he seemingly time travels to 40 years in the future, and he has to abandon the Sentinel. Yada yada yada, he fucks around for a bit, fish out of water type stuff happens, then he meets the sentry drone that Natsuno had. Turns out this robot is actually Miura, his AI, and he had a log from the, quote, future again, of Natsuno, Miura, and Takamiya. This opens our current Miura to the fact that the world isn't what it seems, and it throws everything he knows out of focus. This is made worse by the fact that he sees his, quote, little sister with someone else, and she's acting like an entirely different person. That was a mouthful, but I really love Miura and his story. From being told right away that future shenanigans are going on, to being shown someone in the past that wants nothing more to protect his friends, family, and country. Like, you get a clear understanding of who he is, but the story throws curveballs to show that he doesn't actually know who he is or what the world is. Like, we, the player, know what happened at the end of the Pacific War, so when the giant robots show up to destroy Japan, we know that America had nothing to do with that. He doesn't, but that conveys to the player that there's more than what Miura and the others of this world are led on to believe. When he discovers that he and Natsuno share a relationship in this far distant future that he'd certainly be dead during, and that the drone is him, it speaks of larger things in motion. Despite realizing the lie that surrounds him, he sticks to his guns and remains a pretty static character development-wise. He still wants to serve his country, protect his friends, and it's this passion that drives him to take back the Sentinel and join in the final battle. Sekigahara is a very interesting critter. Through most of the game, he knows what's going on. He's a very cold and distant figure that gets the gist of what's really happening. In the other stories, he's typically one step ahead of anyone else. In his own story, however, he has no memory. He's in an alleyway and believes to have killed the school nurse, the woman that seems to be pulling the strings in all the other stories, the one that has been appearing in multiple people's dreams. He has little to go off of, and all he knows is that he has a weapon, a few items that may or may not be clues, and he has to piece it all together. While this would typically come across as lazy or cliche, the story and the world are already so bizarre that it really works. Like, Sekigahara is a vessel for the viewer to learn things through. Even still, he has a distinct personality instead of being a completely blank slate. It's not up to Sekigahara to learn the entire story for the player, instead his story is focused on two specific things, one being Sekigahara himself and the truth about him, the other being Operation Aegis and what it really is. His story does a great job at focusing on both of these things evenly. The last individual character and story I want to mention is Renya Goto and his own little segment. His is meant to be done at the very end and mostly takes place during or just before the final battle. A lot of his story is him talking with Chihiro, a young girl that, shown via Sekigahara's story, claims to be Morimura and was the real one that killed the nurse. The whole game's story has loose threads for you that you can just piece together. The goal of Goto in this story is to confirm all of this to Chihiro and provides extra context to the player with new logs and flashbacks. He basically says, yeah, I learned all of this information through logs and that probably upset you because you want to eliminate us. And then she pulls a gun on him. Like, that's literally what happens. I like Goto and his story because it's such a great lead into the final moments of the game and truly does a great job of wrapping up a bulk of the main story. His dynamic with Chihiro is that of respect on an intellectual level, and genuinely reasons with her despite knowing that she killed the woman that he had feelings for and that she is a potential threat to his and the other pilot's survival. It's just a great climax and conveys so much in such a simple manner. That's all I have regarding individual characters and their stories. Now let's touch up on specific character moments that don't sit well with me. I wanted to mention this but didn't quite know where to put it in the script, so I guess here will be fine. Hijiyama, Miura, and the same damn joke. Hijiyama and Miura come from the same sector, the same point in time. They both come from the Pacific War era, and they both end up in our 1985. They both have this running joke in both of their stories regarding food. Like, Miura loves hamburger, but he always calls it himburger, and comes up like 2 or 3 times in his story. Hijiyama loves yakisoba-pan, and he talks about it every single story branch and never shuts up about it. Like, it's cute-ish at first, and then it's so draining because he just keeps saying it more and more. I will say though, there is a moment in Hijiyama's story where he meets up with Miura for the first time in the current sector and they reminisce for a bit. Naturally, they both talk about the new foods they've discovered from the era. This takes a tiring running joke and turns it into a genuinely heartwarming moment of two lost friends finding each other, and I really loved this scene.
But I'm telling you, you've got to try this yakisoba-pan. It's the most delicious food this era has to offer.
Takatoshi-san, have you had the chance to try any hamburger?
What is this hamburger?
I have reason to believe it's the greatest culinary invention in history.
You overestimate your burger, my friend.
The other character gripe I have is with Miss Morimura. I'm someone that likes having things properly explained or noted, and this game is one that serves that desire. My problem with Morimura isn't story related, it's the bizarre decision to give her sprite giant knockers. This is gonna make me sound like an incel, but it really does seem weird to me. Like, it's played up for a joke one time in Juro's story, and then never mentioned again. Like, that's how this character should be treated, as a one-off gag, but she's actually super important to the overall story. So why give one of your major characters these unnaturally huge breasts that just bizarrely shake when she walks? Her idle stance is her propping them up, and in other sectors and loops, she's seen wearing a scantily clad black catsuit that just emphasizes it. It's like the character designers realized, oh shit, we need to make this seem more like anime, so they gave an important, recurring character huge tits and skin-tight clothing. If you're going to give her a skin-tight suit for battle, then give Ida a skin-tight catsuit too. Now that I could vibe with. Moving on from character rambling, let's start talking about the story as a whole. Honestly, I don't know how to quite tackle this for this video. Like, I don't want to spoil too much, but I also don't want to undersell it. If you remember my original Persona 3 Keldealysis video, I kinda just didn't say much about the story and very quickly mentioned the overall themes that the game deals with. Looking back, I honestly feel like I did a disservice to Persona 3's story. There is so much more than what I said, so much to unpack and dive into. Super well written and atmospheric events that heighten the themes that I mentioned, like I seriously undersold and underemphasized the brilliance and quality of that story. I mention all of this because 13 Sentinels has a very intricate story with a lot of moving parts. You have 13 different point of views of the same overall story. Like, the story itself is absolutely batshit and bizarre at first, but it all ends up tying the major plot threads together in the end. There's a lot to it, and I don't want to ramble on about the story too terribly much as I feel like it's the main attraction, the main thing people want to experience with the game. However, I also don't want to do a disservice to the story by stepping around it like I did with the previous title. All of this said, I will quickly touch on the story. We are in spoiler territory, so I will discuss what I understood about the overall story, the main takeaway, and why it's great. But again, spoilers, so be advised. So first and foremost, this story is absolutely insane and damn near impossible to summarize. Basically, there's reality, loops, and there's sectors. Reality is, well, reality. It's the current timeline of the in-real IRL in the game. And then there are loops, which are basically the timeline being reset. Finally, there are sectors, which are different miniature simulated areas where our protagonists reside for the majority of the game. I mentioned other years such as 1944 and 2187 and the potential of time travel. The truth of the matter is that time travel was not happening, but instead there are 5 physical sectors that are segmented and based off of different periods in time, all spaced by 40 years. 2105, 2065, 2025, 1985, and 1945. Miura is originally from Sector 5, which is based on 1945. A majority of the game is in 1985, which is Sector 4. They aren't actually traveling through time, but instead traveling through these different sectors. It's shown in Shu Amaguchi's story that his lovely world of 1985 is only about 30 kilometers in diameter. Why is it 30 kilometers? Well, that's because that's how big the UFO underground is. UFO underground, yeah, so there's like this giant saucer thing underground, which is actually the sector structure itself, but also acts as universal control. Universal control is responsible for keeping the sectors in check. Basically, all the people apart from the protagonist and a couple others are generated AI, and universal control keeps them functioning as they should. There is another sector that is actually insanely important, and that is Sector 0. Sector 0 isn't like the other 5 sectors in the sense that it's not a physical space. It is instead a data sector used to store information. To ensure that different characters show up in each loop or that the data can transmit from one cycle to another, characters like Tetsuya Ito will upload data to Sector 0. For him, it's so he can continue on in the next cycle as himself. What is a loop, I hear you asking? Well, a loop is when all of the sectors are wiped and reset from the beginning. A loop is possible when universal control is attacked via the Daimos gaining control of the different mainframe access points. When this happens, everything is reset from the beginning across all the sectors, and only those that had access to Sector 0 will be able to act freely and be themselves in the new world. So the sectors are reset via loops, and the sectors are these artificial spaces inhabited by AI that's controlled by large saucers. What is the reality part? If these are artificial spaces, then what happened to Earth? Well, as you find out in the end, humanity went extinct and all of our protagonists are actually part of Project Ark, which is aimed to send worthy candidates into an inhabitable planet to rebuild the human race. When our protagonists awaken from the pods, they're actually 20 million years in the future past the logs that we see from 2187 and 2188, which was the actual real timeline, which is when our original characters all died off. Our protagonists, at least to my understanding, are clones of the individuals from 2188 using the same data and information stored in Sector 0 to put them through the simulations until they're ready to leave the pods and start rebuilding the species on the new planet. In truth, the Daimos you've been fighting are just simulated, though their success carries consequences of triggering a loop and potentially wiping all of our protagonists from universal control. The Deimos in reality are intended for terraforming, and were actually used to terraform the planet that our protagonists are now on in reality. In 2188, the researchers all had plans and theories about Project Arc before they were killed off. One such individual was Ryoko Shinonome, one of our protagonists. In her story, we see that she had some sort of thirst or craving for Tetsuya Ida. I mean, he's pretty scrumptious, what can I say? Ida is often shown to be the villain and is definitely one of the antagonists in our story. And in this case, he uses Ryoko and she loses all hope for humanity. So she creates the decode, ensuring that the Deimos will keep coming to trigger loops across the sectors, so that reality would be without humanity to ruin it. Why do I love the story of this game? For reasons like that. While this is a very good angle thematically, it also works to build the tension and mystery of the story. At that point in the story, you don't know what's really going on. I mean, what does this log mean by all this? This game works well at building mystery and raising questions, which leads to Rin Yagoto's story at the end, which again, is a super satisfying lead into the climax that ties up a lot of loose ends. There's a lot for the player to discover and figure out on their own, which is great considering that you witness and control the game through all the characters. You get to see just as much information as them, and you, along with the characters, are left to decipher it all. It's super good storytelling, and I don't want to just pick up each scene and be like, oh, well, this is a textbook example as to why it's great, but I will pull one more example just for the sake of proving a point. Juro Kurabe, which is arguably the most important character in the entire story, has dreams. These dreams are super realistic and frightening to him for soon-to-be obvious reasons. Early on in the game, it's revealed that in one of his dreams that an older version of him is killing the current versions of his close friends in a destroyed Japan. At the time, it's like, whoa, what? This took a super dark twist, but obviously the dream isn't just a dream because storytelling 101, why introduce something if it's insignificant? It's revealed that this is actually a memory of Juro Izumi from a prior loop that thought the only way of getting out of the simulation and cycle was to just kill all of the compatible individuals, thus being our protagonist. This way, the decode wouldn't persist in anyone's nanomachines, and thus the Deimos wouldn't come to attack the mainframes, thus triggering the loops in an endless cycle. At first, this moment thwarts the viewer and lingers long enough for you to ask questions. Why is Juro having these realistic dreams? Why are they of this violent nature? And why are all of his friends involved? And what does it really all mean? In the end, we learn that Juro Izumi got desperate. He resorted to only what he felt he could do. In the end, it didn't work, and our current Juro Kurabe is left picking up all the pieces so he can finish the fight. Thematically, I struggled with this game for a while. I tried very hard to find multiple messages or purpose behind a lot of the decisions with the characters of the overall story direction. But in the end, there's only one direct point I can really draw a line from. This game emphasizes the idea that humanity is its own undoing. Heartbreak and manipulation led to Ryoko Shinonome to do what she could to foil Project Arc and rid reality of humans altogether. Izumi's plan of killing off the others didn't work, and in the end, he is instead remembered as a dangerous criminal that persists in the young Kurabe's head. The Sekigahara of 2188 is a literal assassin that plants an explosive to kill Morimura of that time. In contrast, a standout character moment of the game has a dying colony of humans in 2188 refuse the 8-year-old Megumi Yakushiji and her father for the possibility of being infected with a disease that could infect the colony. They're refused for self-preservation and basically told, sorry about your luck, Lamau. The Juro Izumi of this time gives orders to allow him to leave the colony for the purpose of taking the young girl and taking care of her until she's cleared of the potential disease. If she is infected, he says neither of them will return. A very sweet moment of Izumi basically taking the chance to protect the girl from an unfortunate demise, while simultaneously risking his own well-being. This is followed by a line saying,
Our fate was sealed a long time ago.
Is there anything more I really need to say? This whole scene helps shows the importance and positive capability of humanity. Humanity isn't at its best when it doesn't take chances or closes off its own kind. It doesn't thrive when it works to manipulate themselves. The negatives are what led to the colony's failures and the near extinction of humanity. Were it not for Project Arc, humans would not exist in any capacity now. The chance of risking yourself, putting yourself on the line to preserve another life and to take care of those dear is the strength that humanity possesses. It's why looping, selfishness, and ignorance are all common traits in the antagonist. It's why, come the end of the game, everyone shares the same goal. It's why our characters are taking a stand against the impossible odds. It's why, at the end, humanity wins and can begin rebuilding. Humanity is responsible for its own failures, but equally capable of doing something remarkable. It's for scenes like this, reasons like this, that I love 13 Sentinels' story. It gives you a lot to consider and a lot of questions to be answered over the course of the game. On a dime, it can get horribly dark, but manages to keep that rather upbeat, albeit uneasy tone throughout the course of the story. This culminates in a truly exciting climax that is witnessed and explored by 13 different characters that are all well written, unique, and fun to experience. In the end, you're left with a genuine twist and a true message reflective of ourselves as a species. The story will seem absolutely bonkers when you're playing it, but in the end I can say that I have a grasp on it. Like, it's creative and very well written, and despite the somewhat simple visual presentation, it actually builds a genuine atmosphere and has a unique and charming style to it. This game's story is one of my favorites and is truly something that needs to be experienced. It's that damn good. Before we conclude this video, I want to talk about the absolute banger soundtrack that this game has. And you know what? I don't just mean the background music. Every piece of audio in this game is absolutely amazing, from the combat-centered sentinel punches, to the voice acting, and to, of course, the music. The combat sound effects could very well just be stock sounds that have been edited in a certain manner that I just don't instantly pick up on them, but they are seriously very punchy and unique. They have such a distinct and satisfying sound to them that the feedback of landing a successful hit on the enemy is rewarding beyond the player just recognizing, oh wow, I beat that Deimos. It's not just the melee attacks either, the ranged attacks have the same effect to them. Never before have I played a game where the gunfire and melee thuds got me to acknowledge them in any meaningful way, and that alone is a testimony to the quality. Obviously, there's the music. Oh, how I love the music in this game. Between the somber and depressing tones of Staring Into the Void and the hard action tracks like Metal Demon, the score manages to cover all the grounds that a soundtrack would need to without at any point feeling generic or bland. The two tracks I just mentioned are memorable and stylistic in their own right and work to service the game well, despite being two completely different types of tracks entirely. Hell, the title theme itself, Brat Overflow, is such a strong and recognizable theme, and it's even better because it's remixed for the final wave. Oh, and it's not just the sound effects and music are good, they're also used very effectively. One thing that seems to carry throughout the Persona series is that despite the amazing music that's present, there isn't a good presentation of the tracks. This makes sense because while you're listening to the background track, it's exactly that, a musical sting in the background of a scene. It's used to service the scene, not be the focal point. That said, there are sometimes clear transitional stutters in Persona where you quite clearly reach a trigger in the game script that causes the current track to just stop for another one to start playing. I mention all of this because 13 Sentinels didn't have this, at least not that I've noticed. In fact, I was impressed as sometimes the background tracks were overlaid to create a more gradual and subtle transition between the two, while also evoking two different reactions or acknowledgement from the player. Sometimes the tracks will be mixed quietly for certain scenes so that you focus more on the characters and what's happening. This is present in other games, sure, I'm just pointing it out here because it's genuinely done to a really good extent. It's done so well in fact that I felt the need to mention it in this video. Then there's Wave 210. Oh sweet Jesus ever-loving Christ, how I absolutely adore Wave 210, quite possibly my favorite segment from any video game, and this moment would be nothing without the music. I said I'd get back to it later, here we are, we're gonna talk about it. Let me set the scene real quick. Mayuki Inaba, our pop idol AI helper through the Sentinel vs Deimos journey, starts by telling us that she'll be pulled out of orbit and incapable of helping her team until she returns in 14 hours. Up to this point, our pilots have been reaching their limits. We've been told the potential dangers that overworking yourself in the Sentinel can do to your brain, and we've seen the Deimos get stronger and more destructive with each passing minute. The estimated Mayuki downtime is 14 hours, setting up for an obvious good guys down on their luck climax. Amiguchi pops in to ask Mayuki to sing for the pilots.
As long as you're still here, maybe you could sing for us?
Alright. As long as you can hear my voice, you'll know I'm still connected.
Mayuki's line, the beautiful and upbeat track of Seaside Vacation, the rough and linear wave with the colorful thermile missiles, all of this contributes to a wonderful spectacle that is motivating and instills hope to the player during a climax that looks rather grim for our protagonist. It's the perfect thematic and emotional turnaround that really gets you to want to work to persevere against the odds. Truly one of my favorite moments from any video game that I can think of, and while the presentation seems simple, it is insanely effective and truly stands out for what it is. It's just a shame that you can cheese it. Previously on the channel, I've talked about Persona 3. I mentioned that it's one of my favorite games of all time, and I've honestly considered it to be a close second to my all-time favorite game, Fallout New Vegas. I'm not exaggerating when I say that 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is right up there with those two as one of my personal all-time faves. There is so much to love and adore about the game with very little that I can consider a slight negative. Honestly, the biggest problem with the game is that it's primarily story focused, thus making repeated playthroughs not as enjoyable as subsequent runs of something like a New Vegas or Persona. The gameplay segments in 13 Sentinels is still really fun, but since it's an RTS with set spawning and very little variation, if you manage to master a wave once, you'll likely do it every time afterwards. When I finished Persona 3, my first reaction was to crave more, to play it again and do more in it. When I finished 13 Sentinels, I was simply very satisfied with the experience. It's a remarkable 40-hour game, it's one of my favorites and I'll always think positively of it, but I don't see myself replaying the core game itself anytime soon, and that is truly unfortunate. Well, that's all I have for you today. If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to leave a like, and if you have any thoughts regarding the video, then leave me a comment down below. If you want more content like this, then I encourage you to subscribe to the channel and check out some of my other videos. I also stream on Twitch every once in a while, so feel free to stop by whenever. Anyways, that's all I have for you today. Thank you, and have a great one.